The young and the restless spoilers shock in a world already unraveling, where loyalty was traded for leverage and family bonds strained beneath the weight of legacy and ambition. The return of Colin Atkinson ignited a firestorm that threatened to consume everything in its path. Genoa City had endured scandals, betrayals, and corporate warfare for decades, but nothing could prepare it for the storm now rising. Not when the dead refused to stay buried and vengeance was no longer whispered in shadows, but spoken aloud like prophecy. Colin was alive. And that truth alone shattered more than a few illusions. For months, perhaps even years, the world had accepted his disappearance as final, a fatal footnote in a long and tangled history of cons, manipulations, and betrayals. There had been no body, no funeral, no confirmed cause of death. Just silence, and a story that had been swallowed up by the relentless pace of time and other tragedies. But now, that silence had been broken, and what emerged was a man not broken by death, but forged by it. Colin had not died. He had escaped. And in that escape, he had been reborn. Far from the chaos of Genoa City, hidden in the shadowy quarters of old Paris, Colin had disappeared into the world of the forgotten, men with nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. What began as survival quickly evolved into something far more dangerous. He didn't just lay low, he built. He listened. He learned. He surrounded himself with those who owed him loyalty, not because of money or fear, but because they, too, had been burned by powerful men who thought themselves untouchable. Men like Victor Newman. Victor. The name itself was a wound. For all the world believed that Victor and Colin had once been minor rivals, tangential forces in the same orbit. The truth was far more sinister. According to Colin, Victor had done more than sabotage deals or undermine ventures. He had waged war on Colin's family, systematically dismantling their financial security, sabotaging overseas assets, and leaking false intelligence to authorities that had left Colin hunted and cornered like an animal. When Colin tried to fight back, the trap had already been sprung. Betrayed by allies, abandoned by institutions, and framed in a scandal involving international finance and corruption, Colin had lost everything in a matter of days. And then, just as quickly, he vanished. Some believed he had fled in shame. Others assumed he'd been murdered by one of his many enemies. But the truth, as Colin now told it, was far crueler. He had been left to die. Cut off, stranded in a European safe house as the net closed in, Colin narrowly escaped death during a violent raid. Everyone around him perished. He survived only by sheer luck or fate, depending on who told the story. Injured, weakened, and presumed dead, Colin had found refuge in the underbelly of Paris. And from those ashes, he began again. What had once been desperation soon became strategy. He changed his name, buried his past, and began accumulating power under a new identity. With time, connections, and quiet ruthlessness, Colin re-emerged not as a man in exile, but as a king in disguise. The empire he built was not gilded like Victor's, but forged in loyalty and silence, made of shadows and secrets. And now, at last, he was ready to come back, not to reclaim, but to destroy. And Cain, his son, had never truly been Aristotle Dumas. He was merely the voice, the symbol, the mask that allowed Colin to remain hidden in plain sight. Every calculated move, every manipulative corporate acquisition, every whisper in the media, it had all been orchestrated by a man the world thought long dead. And Cain, forever caught between wanting to impress his father and escaping his shadow, had submitted once more. No matter how many times he tried to redefine himself, he always found his destiny knotted to the fate of the man who raised him. When Colin revealed himself, stepping into the light at a private meeting deep beneath the Paris Opera House, where Victor's name was invoked like a curse, the room froze. Cain's eyes filled with disbelief and then guilt. For all his sins, all his deceptions, Cain had never been prepared for this moment, to see the man he mourned standing alive, whole, and angry. "I should be dead," Colin said, his voice heavy with years of silence. Victor saw to that. He thought he won. But the mistake men like him always make is thinking time erases enemies. Cain could barely breathe. His father, the man he had grieved, buried in memory, had returned not with forgiveness, but with fire. Colin had no interest in reconciliation. He wanted blood. He wanted Victor to lose everything, and he wanted Cain to deliver the final blow. "You were never meant to lead alone," Colin said, pacing the room. "You were the face. That's all. The son who would be welcomed back while the world still pitied your loss. But now? Now they will fear you. Because you are mine. And when Victor Newman looks into your eyes, I want him to see me." Cain, torn between love and terror, nodded. But Colin wasn't finished. He turned to the others in the room, financiers, corporate mercenaries, ex-intelligence operatives, and declared publicly what he had never dared say before, that Victor Newman was the architect of his downfall. That Victor had weaponized his influence to sabotage Colin's investments, to manipulate the media, to pay off international courts, and to erase the Atkinson name from legitimacy. "He destroyed my family," Colin snarled. "And then he buried me in lies. But now, I rise from that grave, and he will fall into it." The declaration sent ripples through every circle of influence across Europe and the Americas. News of Colin's survival was not made public, but those who mattered. The elite, the powerful, heard the whisper. And Victor, when he learned of it, did not laugh. He closed the door to his office at Newman Tower and stared out at the skyline. He knew. It was only a matter of time before the past came for him. Colin had not only returned, but he had recruited his son, turned his sorrow into rage, and built a machine of revenge fueled by years of silence. He didn't want headlines, he wanted legacy. He didn't want to win one battle. He wanted to destroy Victor so completely that even the name Newman would never again be spoken without shame. And Cain? Torn between his father's expectations and the guilt clawing at his soul, he found himself adrift. Victor had spared Charlie. Victor had offered mercy. But Colin demanded war. And for Cain, the choice was no longer about business. It was about blood. Because in the end, the return of Colin Atkinson wasn't just the resurrection of a man. It was the beginning of a reckoning that Genoa City would never forget. Would you like the next part to be about Colin's public return, or Victor preparing a counterattack, or perhaps Charlie and Matilda confronting Cain about what he's become? The silence after Colin's outburst was broken not by resistance, not by rage, but by something far more unexpected: Victor Newman's knees collapsing beneath him. It was not theatrical. There was no pretense of surrender in the way his body slumped toward the polished marble floor. The man who had towered over industries, families, and enemies for decades, who had crushed rebellion with a stare, who had outlived kings and driven his rivals to madness, was now on his knees. His breathing shallow. His back slightly hunched. His hands, for the first time in memory, trembled. His voice, when it finally emerged, was not sharp, not cold, but tired. And strangely, broken. "I did this," he said simply, looking up at Colin, whose fury boiled like acid in his veins. "This war, I lit the match. I lit it a long time ago, and I never looked back." The room froze. Even Cain, paralyzed by the emotional carnage unfolding before him, couldn't speak. Victor's fall wasn't just symbolic, it was seismic. This wasn't some calculated maneuver, no decoy ploy to manipulate sympathy or buy time. This was real. For the first time since this battle began, Victor Newman, the lion, the tactician, the storm, had allowed himself to be seen not as a force of nature, but as a man bearing the weight of everything he had broken. And the weight was immense. He looked around the room, at Colin, at Cain, at the men and women who had followed this campaign of vengeance, and then turned his eyes toward the door, almost as if searching for someone who would never walk through it again. Perhaps Nikki. Perhaps his children. Perhaps those ghosts who had fallen by his side along the way. You think I don't know what I've done? Victor said, voice coarse now. You think I don't wake up every night hearing the names of the people I buried, the ones I destroyed just to win another meaningless battle? I know. God help me, I know. But the sins of my past don't excuse yours, Colin. Colin's face contorted in fury. Excuse mine, he spat. You tried to erase me. You ripped my family apart. Stole my reputation, turned my allies into traitors, buried me alive and fed lies to the world. And now you sit there on your knees and ask for what? Mercy? Victor didn't flinch. No, he said, quietly. I'm not asking for mercy. I'm asking for your hand to spare the people who had nothing to do with this. Let them return to Genoa. Let this end with us. Colin's lips twisted into something between disbelief and hatred. His voice cracked from screaming, his chest heaving as the years of silence erupted into fire. You don't get to choose how this ends, Victor. Not anymore. You controlled the narrative for decades. You were the puppeteer, everyone else just dancing. Not this time. Not me. You think falling to your knees buys redemption? You think these tears mean anything? But Victor didn't cry. His eyes were clear. Red, exhausted, perhaps, but dry. I'm not trying to be redeemed, he said. I'm trying to stop you from becoming me. The words hit harder than anything Victor had said before. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't an excuse. It was a curse spoken from one damned man to another. The kind of truth that cracked through even Colin's thickest armor. For a second, just a second, the room stood still, and something shifted behind Colin's glare. Not sympathy. Not forgiveness. But recognition. Recognition of a darkness that had lived in both of them, fed by the same hunger. To be feared, to be remembered, to never be vulnerable again. But Colin had not returned for redemption. He had not waited in the shadows of Paris to heal. He had come to destroy. Everyone returns to Genoa, Victor said again, more firmly now. You want revenge? I'll be there. Waiting. I won't run. I won't hide. Come for me. Fight your war. But leave them out of it. Cain stepped forward, stunned. Is this a challenge? He asked, unable to mask his confusion. Or is this begging? Victor turned his gaze on Cain and spoke slowly. It's both. That answer hung in the air like smoke, haunting, impossible to grasp. And in that moment, even Colin hesitated. The fury, still hot, now crackled with confusion. There was no victory in watching your greatest enemy surrender. There was no satisfaction in seeing the man you built your vengeance around suddenly offer himself like a lamb. It wasn't justice. It wasn't revenge. It was an ending without fire. And yet, something about it terrified Colin more than Victor's power ever had, because this wasn't a ploy. This wasn't a trap. It was real. Victor Newman was done. Colin stepped forward, fists clenched, his body shaking not from weakness but from rage that no longer knew where to go. He leaned down, inches from Victor's face. You will suffer, he whispered. Every deal you made, I will unravel. Every ally you protected, I will expose. And every child who still clings to your name. I will make them question everything you ever stood for. You won't die quickly, Victor. You'll decay, piece by piece, until you're just a memory they're too ashamed to keep. Victor nodded. So be it. Colin pulled back, breath ragged, chest heaving. He turned to his men and gave the order, send them home. One by one, the hostages, the guests on the train, the pawns in the battle, were led to safety. No one said a word. No one looked back. The war had not ended. It had only been postponed. But for now, blood would not be spilled. Victor remained on his knees long after the others had gone. Only Cain stayed behind, watching him. Conflicted. Shattered. Why? Cain finally asked. Why let it come to this? Why let him have the last word? Victor looked up at him, eyes clear. Because I've had the last word for too long. And with that, he rose, slowly, stiffly, and walked into the darkness of the train's corridor. Not as a man broken, but as one who had finally chosen to stop pretending he wasn't. Back in Paris, Colin watched the sun set from the highest balcony of his chateau. He had won. But the victory felt hollow. Victor had handed him the empire of retribution, and with it, all the emptiness that came from chasing ghosts too long. In Genoa City, the storm was just beginning to form. And when it broke, it would drown them all. Would you like the next chapter to explore Victor's return to Genoa and fallout with his family, or Colin's next strike, perhaps targeting Nick, Victoria, or Newman Enterprises directly? The early morning light settled gently across the Paris skyline, brushing the city's rooftops with pale gold. But in the corner office of a chateau that had once belonged to aristocrats and now bore the mark of a new empire, the air was still, heavy with things unsaid. Cain Ashby stood by the window, hands in his pockets, back straight, eyes distant, a man who had run too far, built too much, and buried too many truths to ever really breathe easily again. Behind him, Victor Newman waited, arms folded, the lines of exhaustion etched into his face as deeply as the power that still lingered in his posture. The war between them had stalled, but the wound remained fresh, an open battlefield of legacy, pride, and unspoken grief. It was Cain who finally broke the silence. I didn't steal this, he said, voice low, resolute. Everything I've built, the investments, the expansion, the partnerships, it's all legitimate. And I couldn't have done it without my father. Victor didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He merely watched, as if waiting to see whether this was the start of another deception or something far rarer, the truth. Cain turned around, walked to the center of the room, and let the weight of his story settle between them. 6 years ago, Colin found out he was sick. He never told anyone, not you, not the authorities, not even the family. Just me. And instead of spending those years chasing a cure or seeking redemption, he decided to give me everything he never had the courage to build himself. Victor's brow lifted slightly, skeptical. You expect me to believe Colin Atkinson built you an empire out of goodwill? Cain's eyes flashed, not with arrogance, but sorrow. No. Not goodwill. Guilt. There it was, the fracture in his voice, the shift in posture. Cain wasn't speaking as Aristotle Dumas anymore. He was speaking as a son. A son who had watched his father deteriorate not just physically, but spiritually, over time. He sold off a massive piece of land he had hidden under one of his aliases, Cain continued. It was quiet. Clean. Legal. He never touched the profits. Instead, he gave it all to me, on one condition, that I use it to build something he never could. We took the money and began investing heavily in crypto before the first major bull market. That explosion, it made us. From there, we diversified, startups, commodities, medical research. Every move was documented, every paper signed. No shell companies. No offshores. Just smart, aggressive moves backed by clean capital. Victor's gaze narrowed. So you're telling me that this empire, it's his apology? Cain nodded slowly. His legacy. But one I made my own. The words hung in the air for a moment, almost softening the room, almost. But then Cain continued, voice trembling with the edge of grief now surfacing. Colin died 6 months ago, he said. It was fast. Quiet. I was there. I held his hand. I told him I forgave him. And when he closed his eyes for the last time, I promised him I would walk away from all of this once I no longer needed it. Victor blinked, not because he was surprised, but because grief, no matter how expected, always stung. He had buried too many people himself not to understand the weight of those final promises. I kept building after he died, Cain added. But I lost the fire. It wasn't about power anymore. It wasn't about proving myself. It was about honoring his last wish. Victor finally spoke, voice steady but cold. And now? Cain stepped forward, gaze unwavering. Now, I want a new beginning. I'm ready to let go of most of it. Sell a controlling stake. Clean house. But I want Chancellor in return. That name, Chancellor, landed like a thunderclap. Victor straightened. You think I'd give you Chancellor? He asked, incredulous. You show up here, drop your tragic little monologue, and expect me to trade the legacy of Catherine Chancellor for a portfolio built on crypto? Cain stood his ground. I'm not asking for Catherine's legacy. I'm asking for a chance to redeem mine. Victor scoffed, his voice rising for the first time. You don't get redemption just because you buried your father and cried over spreadsheets. Chancellor is more than just a company. It's a symbol. A bloodline. You don't trade symbols. You protect them. Cain's fists clenched, but he stayed calm. I'm offering you leverage. You know the markets better than anyone, Victor. What I have, what Dumas Holdings controls, could swallow Jabot and Newman combined if it wanted to. But I don't want that. I'm tired. I want something that matters. Something stable. I want to return home with my name, Cain Ashby, and something real to rebuild around. Chancellor is part of that. Victor walked slowly to the edge of the desk, placing both hands on the surface like a general addressing his rival one last time. You want something real? He asked. Then earn it the way everyone else has. Not by blackmail. Not by legacy swaps. You think you've changed, Cain? Then prove it. Return to Genoa with your empire still intact, not burned down in exchange for a throne that was never meant for you. Cain's jaw tightened. So that's it? Victor nodded. That's it. The silence returned, sharper this time. Cain stood there, simmering, but not with rage, with loss. This wasn't just about a company. This was about a man who had spent years trying to escape the shadow of a father who built his kingdom from lies, only to realize too late that legacy can't be inherited. It has to be earned. And Chancellor, that was something Victor would never hand over. Not to him. Not to anyone. I'll walk away, Cain said finally. From the Dumas name. From the empire. I'll let it all go, sell the assets, break it up. But I'll do it on my terms. Victor didn't answer. Cain turned to leave, but paused at the door. You're right, he said softly. Colin gave me his guilt and dressed it as success. But I turned it into something real. And now, I'll turn it into something human. And then he was gone. Victor remained behind, watching the sun rise higher. He had won again. But something inside him, something far more vulnerable than he'd ever admit, shifted. Cain was no longer a threat. He was something else now. A reminder that even kings must one day return to dust. And that the next war may not be fought with weapons,